Welcome back to another learning series with Mr. Knight. Now, today we're going to look at food chain and food web. Now, I want you to bear with me with this lesson, okay? Because I'm going to look at a few things before I go into what food chains and food webs are, okay? So just bear with me, folks. Now, what I want to have is an image of what a food chain looks like and also what a food web looks like. So this is an example of a food chain. So I want to look at it carefully and see what it looks like. And now an example of a food web. So look carefully, folks, and have both images in your mind, okay? Now, all right, now you have that mental image. Now let's fly into a few defining terms and some key points. Now, a food chain, folks, is a food chain now shows a single path for the flow of energy between organisms. Now, a food chain is pretty much what they say linear, one straight path or one straight line for the flow of energy. Now, a food web is an interconnection of food chains showing multiple pathways for the flow of energy between organisms. That means there are multiple pathways for energy to flow. Now, the big difference between food chain and food web is that one has a single path, which is a food chain, and a food web has multiple pathways. Okay, that's the difference right there. All right. Now, other points to note is that predators. Now, a predator is an organism that hunts, kills, and eats other organisms. Okay. Now, a prey is an organism that is being hunted, killed, and being eaten by a predator. Now, autotrophs, very important for us to know this. And of course, you're going to use these terms quite often throughout this lesson as well. Now, autotrophs, they are organisms that makes their own food. They convert inorganic substances to organic substances, and very important for us to remember is that they occupy the producer trophic levels in food chains and food web. So an example of autotroph will be plants. They make their own food. Okay, so plants, algae, and plant planktons, they make their own food. They can able to photosynthesize, so they are called autotrophs. Okay, and they occupy the producer levels. Now, heterotrophs are animals like us, and heterotrophs are organisms that depend on other organisms for food. Okay, we cannot make our own food, folks, so we have to eat other organisms to get some food, right? So we are heterotrophs. All right. So the word auto actually means self, and the word trophic or refers to feeding. So it says self-feeding, and hetero is other, so you depend on other for food. All right, just to kind of remember that auto is self, trophic refers to feeding. All right, now trophic level, key point is that trophic level is each feeding level of a food chain or a food web. Okay, so it's each feeding level, and it starts from the producer. So the producer is the first trophic level. Okay, it is feeding, but it's making its own food, so it's still a trophic level. Remember, don't forget that the trophic level starts from the producer. All right, now consumer level, this is each feeding level of a food web, but it starts from the herbivore. It starts from the herbivore. In other words, it starts after the producer. It starts after the producer. So the difference between trophic level and consumer level is that the trophic level is all the feeding levels of the food chain starting from the producer, but the consumer level starts after the producer. In other words, now the heterotrophs occupy the consumer level. Okay, and the trophic level is all starting from the producer. That's the difference. So heterotrophs occupy the consumer levels. Okay, so just want to have that in your mind. Now, producers. So we talk about producers just now, and they are autotrophs. Remember now. So producers are organisms that are classified as what? autotrophs. We just mentioned that. Example, plants. So these organisms start the food web and supply energy to all other organisms. Okay, so they are responsible for the energy in the food chain or food web, folks. Now, consumer level, the consumers. Now, consumers now, they are organisms that are classified as heterotroph. So, consumer level, they are heterotrophs. And that's why I mentioned before that consumer level pretty much contain all the heterotrophs, okay? And these organisms start after the producer. So, notice the word autotrophs connect to producer. The word heterotrophs connect to consumer. So tie those words together, folks, and blend them together, and now you can get a better understanding of heterotroph, producer, autotrophs, and so on. All right, good. Now, consumers can be classified under 3 categories, and so the one type of consumer are called herbivores, and they are also called primary consumer, and they eat only plants or plant-like organisms such as plant plankton and algae. Okay. Now carnivores eat only animals or meat. Okay, such as lions. All right. Now omnivores, they eat both plants and animals such as us, because we will eat our vegetables, we eat chicken and so on. So we eat corn, so we eat plants, and we eat animals. So we are omnivore. We have more than one food sources or type. All right. Now going further, these are some organisms that sometimes overlook in food chain, but they're also important for the cycling of nutrients and the cycling of substance within the ecosystem. So they are very important to us. Okay. And so we have decomposers, and decomposers are organisms that break down dead organic materials and organic waste. And such example of these organisms will be bacteria. So bacteria help to break down these dead stuff and recycle substances or nutrients within the ecosystem. Now another one that are called detritivores, and detritivores are organisms that feed on debris or detritus. Okay, so those debris that are there in the ecosystem, these organisms will feed on them, and examples of these organisms will be earthworms and crabs. So they feed on those remains, or what they call debris or detritus. All right. Now going further is that key terms that going to be very important in the lesson or the next couple of slides coming up is that biomass. Now biomass, this is a total of all living materials in a specific area or habitat. And something to remember, or to help you to remember this, is that bio means living, and mass refers to part of a matter, because all matter will has mass. Okay, so bio, living, mass, matter. Okay, so all the living material or all the living matter within that ecosystem, okay, or area or habitat. Now bioaccumulation, which is something I think you need to remember. Please write it down, have it jotted down somewhere. Please remember it, because we're also going to discuss it. Now bioaccumulation, this is the gradual build up of chemicals such as pesticides or other contaminants in an organism. So these substances that are unable to break down, they build up in the living things. So they accumulate in living things. So notice again, bio-living, accumulation means to build up. So we have the build up of these substances within the living organism. Okay, and these are not necessarily good substances, and so they are hard to break down, and they remain in the food chain or food web for a long period of time without being broken down. All right. Now let's put it all together. All together now. All of those terms, just remember them. You can always review, go back and look at them again and see what they mean, but we're going to put it all together now. Now, before you even start the whole thing, I want to point out a few things right here now. So now you get the exciting part. You can see the pictures and diagrams. Okay, now let's point out a few things first. The arrows within the food chain indicate 2 things. It indicate, one, the flow of energy. So that, which means energy is flowing from the sun right through, and it also represents what is being eaten by. Okay, so I indicate the energy flowing from the sun in yellow because cabbage don't eat the sun. Okay, Okay, so just to make a note of that. So what is happening here though? There's an arrow, and so there's a flow of energy going this way. So let's talk about the flow of energy a little bit. Now the sun supplies solar energy. So the cabbage or the producer, notice the key word again, producer. So the cabbage or the producer will convert solar energy into chemical energy. So starting from the producer going up, we have a flow of chemical energy. So starting from the producer going up, we have a flow of chemical energy. All right, very important to note. Okay, the flow of energy. Now, the sun is not necessarily a part of a food chain because it's not a living thing, but it is supplying energy for the food chain. So the food chain gets its energy from outside, which is the sun. So the sun supplies the food chain. Notice now, the sun supplies the food chain with energy. But the primary source of energy production within the food chain is the producer. Okay, so the producer is responsible to supply chemical energy. Notice the key word here. Supplies chemical energy. Not just any energy, but chemical form. Because the consumers, they are not able to take in chemical energy, solar energy. They need chemical energy. And the producer is producing just that. Okay, so now, we talk about consumer, talk about producer. So the cabbage is an autotroph, making its own food, and it is the producer. Now, starting from the caterpillar, which is a consumer. Now, let's talk about consumer or heterotrophs. So the first heterotroph here will be the grasshopper, then the bird, then the snake. So it's the first consumer, second consumer, third consumer. We can also call them primary consumer, secondary consumer, and their tertiary consumer. Okay, so now you understand the producer, the consumer. Now the other 2 points that we mentioned earlier was trophic level and consumer levels. The trophic level, we say, starts from the producer, and so the cabbage will be the first trophic level, caterpillar second, bird third, and the snake fourth. So this food chain has 4 trophic levels. Let's look at the consumer levels now. Consumer levels start from the caterpillar, and hence in this we have 1 consumer, 2 consumer, 3 consumer. So therefore we have 3 consumer levels in this food chain. And a point to note, folks, is that consumer level is always 1 less than the trophic level. So if we have 4 trophic levels, we only have 3 consumer levels, and that is something that you need to note. Okay, so if you should have 5, or let's say you have 10 trophic levels, then you will have 9 consumer levels, and that is something that you need to remember now, folks. Now additionally, and bear with me now, folks, additionally, you should remember that there are certain things that are decreasing in the food chain, and there are certain things that are increasing in the food chain, and let's look at them. Now, going from the cabbage going up, the number of organisms will decrease, and also the energy by approximately 10%. Okay, so let's look at the number of organisms and why is so. Now, if you're eating something, let's say the caterpillar is eating the cabbage, okay, and let's say there are less cabbage and there are more caterpillars, then some of the caterpillars will not get food and will starve, right? So what is supplying the energy must be greater than what is receiving the energy. Let's say the bird is only eating the caterpillar, and there's say 10 birds and only one caterpillar, then eventually birds will not have any food. Okay, so going up the food chain, the number of organisms decreases. Okay, you need to remember that the number of organisms decreases. All right, now energy also decreased by 10%, but to compensate for this loss, the larger organisms tend to eat more of the smaller organisms. Okay, and so they kind of compensate for that by eating much more. Okay, what also increase? We have persistent chemicals. So if you have chemicals in the food chain that are not broken down, then they bioaccumulate, which means they are building up. that means they're increasing in concentration or number along the food chain. Okay, and you see all of this in display in a very short while. So let's dive right into it. Now, energy efficiency of a food chain is showing you how efficient the food chain is based on the decrease of energy. Okay, remember we talk about energy decrease by 10%, so we're emphasizing this point. Energy decreases by 10%. Okay, now let's say, for example, the cabbage will produce or supply 10,000 kilojoules of energy. So it's convert the solar energy into 10 kilojoules of energy. Okay, 10,000 kilojoules of energy. Now, only 10% of that energy is being passed on to the caterpillars. What happened to the remaining energy? The cabbage will use that other percent of energy for its own development, growth, and life functions, okay? Because, of course, the cabbage requires energy as well. Now, passing on only 100 kilojoules of energy to the cabbage, and these numbers are only for example purposes, right? We're not saying cabbage produce 10,000 kilojoules of energy, okay? It can be much more, but we're just saying these are just example numbers for understanding purposes. Now, the caterpillar now will eat the cabbage and only receive 100 kilojoules of energy, okay? Now, 10% is being passed on to the bird, so therefore is only 100 kilojoules of energy, and 10% is passed on to the snake, now is only 10 kilojoules of energy. And if there should be another organism, it will be 1, and then go to 0.1, and so on. So it all is decreasing by 10% approximately. Now, something to note again, that shorter food chains tend to be more efficient. Why? Because there's less energy loss, and there are more energy conserved for the organism. Okay, longer food chains are less efficient because the further you go, the more decrease in energy. That means a lot of energy is being lost, and those organisms will have to eat much more to sustain themselves. All right. Now, let's look at bioaccumulation. Now, bioaccumulation, now again, remember, is the persistent chemicals such as pesticide being built up within the food chain, okay, or the food web. Now, let's take, for example, if we should spray onto the cabbage, let's say 2 parts per million of poison onto each cabbage or each leaf, okay, just say. And now the caterpillar, remember, now these substances are not being broken down, so it's remain in the substance or on the plants or in the organism. Now, let's say the caterpillar eats only 2 of the cabbage, okay, so eating 2 of the cabbage or 2 leaves. Now remember, now if each cabbage has 2 and the caterpillar eats 2, then they multiply 2 by 2, you get 4. So you get 4 parts per million in each caterpillar. Let's say now the bird, because you have to eat more going up, let's say the bird now eats 4 caterpillars, okay, and each caterpillar contain what? 4 parts per million. And eating 4 caterpillars, you multiply 4 that is being eaten by the bird by the 4 parts per million in each caterpillar. Now you have 16 parts per million in that bird. Now, let's say the snake now eating 2 birds, only eating 2 birds, and what is this now? 16 parts per million multiplied by those 2, because each bird contains 16, multiplied by 2 that is being eaten, a whopping 32 parts per million of poison will be in the snake. So notice we only started from 2 and end up with 32 just by multiplication based on the number of organisms being eaten. Let's say even going further, then 10 animals is being eaten. You can imagine that number. Okay, so remember now, bioaccumulation is the built-up of these substances as they go along the food chain, because as they go along the food chain, the larger organism eat much more and hence increase in concentration of the persistent chemicals. Okay, right. Now, a food web, and we're going to close with this piece now, the food web. And remember what a food web is. A food web is an interconnection of food chains. So in other words, a lot of food chains connected together, and there are more than one pathways for energy to flow. So let's look at the first one here, or just one of them. From the cabbage to the caterpillar to the bird to the snake, and that's what the first food chain we looked at, right? And it could continue to the orc. We can also move from the cabbage to the insect, to the bird, to the snake, to the orc, or we can even come back to the cabbage, to the insect, to the bird, to the orc. And so there are multiple ways, right? And the cabbage to a rodent, to the orc, All right, that could be a next food chain, or it could even go from the cabbage to the rodent to the cat, and of course, if the hawk could manage to eat the cat, then of course an arrow could go like that as well. But it's showing you the fact that the food chain is showing you multiple pathways. That's the difference between the food chain. But I'm also going to remind you that all the things that we looked at on the food chain still apply to a food web. Still apply to a food web. Okay, all of those points apply to a food web. Now, folks, again, this is the end of it, and I thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your time. Thank you for keep watching in. And of course, look out for the next video, and I look forward to see you again. So you can just hit the subscribe button to make sure that you're not missing out. So see you in the next lesson, my gentle people.